iconic logo stitched across the chest. It looked as if it belonged to a superhero rather than a 16-year-old high schooler. The polyester fabric caught the dim light filtering into his room, giving it an almost magical glow. He ran his thumb over the patch, shaking his head in disbelief. In just a few hours, he'd be at Crypto.com Arena for his first shift. His first job. And not just any job. Working at the very stadium players he idolized came alive on the court. The sound of a chair scraping across the kitchen floor broke Ethan's reverie. He set the uniform down carefully, folding it neatly, then walked down the narrow hall. He paused when he saw his mom, Mrs. Carter, sitting at the small kitchen table. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and her fingers rubbed at the circles under her eyes. She'd just come off a long night shift at the hospital, still wearing her scrubs. A coffee mug steamed in front of her, but she hadn't taken a sip. "Hey, Mom," Ethan greeted. He tried to sound cheerful. "You're up early." She looked up and offered a tired smile. "Couldn't sleep. I wanted to see you off before your first day." Her voice was warm but laced with that same weary note that Ethan had grown used to over the years. "Thanks." He stepped closer, hesitating before asking, "How's Lily doing?" "She's still sleeping. Yesterday was a little rough with her breathing, but the inhaler helped." Mrs. Carter glanced at the fridge, where a handwritten note reminded them to pick up more medication. "She'll be okay." Ethan nodded, feeling the familiar knot of responsibility tighten in his chest. His little sister's asthma had always been a worry. And with money tight, every trip to the pharmacy felt like walking a financial tightrope. That's part of why he had taken this job. The extra income would help cover the rising costs of Lily's treatments. And maybe, just maybe, make things a little easier on their mom. "You're going to do great," Mrs. Carter said suddenly, reaching out to squeeze his arm. Her smile brightened, and for a moment, the dark circles under her eyes seemed less noticeable. "Just remember, be polite, work hard, and always show up 15 minutes early. You're a Carter. You know how to give it your best." Ethan grinned. "I'll make you proud." "You already do," she replied. The bus ride to the arena felt surreal. Ethan sat by the window, watching the city come alive as the sun rose higher. Cars honked in the distance, and pedestrians moved with purpose along the streets. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted Lily, who had just woken up. "I'll text you during my break. Love you." The bus rumbled to a stop, and Ethan stepped off, staring at the imposing structure of the arena. He could see the massive screens outside, advertising the next home game. He adjusted his backpack strap and took a deep breath. This was it. Inside, the air was cooler, the smell of fresh popcorn and hot dogs already wafting through the hallways. He followed a security guard's directions to the employee entrance, where a stern-looking man with glasses and a clipboard waited. "Mr. Graham," his new supervisor. "Carter, right?" Mr. Graham asked without looking up. "You're early. That's good. First day jitters?" "No, sir. Just ready to get started." Ethan replied quickly. Too quickly. Mr. Graham raised an eyebrow. "Well, let's see if that enthusiasm holds. Follow me," he said, turning on his heel and striding through the maze of hallways. Ethan hurried to keep up, trying to memorize every turn. The kitchen area was a flurry of activity. Workers stacking trays, unloading boxes of snacks, and refilling soda dispensers. The smell of melting butter on popcorn made Ethan's stomach rumble. Rule number 1. Always wash your hands before handling food or drinks, Mr. Graham said, his voice clipped. Rule number 2. Keep your station clean and organized at all times. And the most important rule, he paused to give Ethan a sharp look, no special treatment for anyone. No autographs, no photos, and absolutely no exceptions. Break that rule, and you're out. Understood? Yes, sir. Good. Sophie will show you the ropes. Mr. Graham gestured to a woman about 10 years older than Ethan, who smiled warmly. Her name tag said, Sophie. Don't let him scare you too much, she said, giving Mr. Graham a mock glare. He didn't react, simply jotting something down on his clipboard before walking off. He's all bark and no bite, Sophie added in a lower voice. Ethan wasn't so sure, but he nodded politely. Sophie quickly showed him how to work the register, mix the special sports drinks, and restock ice. She pointed out little tricks, Like how to balance the cups just right so they wouldn't topple over and how to listen for the exact sound that meant the popcorn was perfectly popped. "You're catching on fast," she said as Ethan placed a perfectly stacked row of nacho trays into the warmer. "You'll be ready for game night in no time." By lunch break, Ethan felt more confident. He sat in the small employee break room, eating the sandwich his mom had packed. Pulling out his phone, he sent Lily another quick text. She responded immediately. "Have you seen LeBron yet?" Ethan chuckled and replied, "Not yet. But I'll keep an eye out." As the afternoon went on, Ethan continued learning the ropes. Customers trickled in for arena tours, and Ethan served them with a bright smile. He thought about what his mom had said, about showing up and doing his best. Every "thank you" and "have a nice day" brought him closer to his first paycheck. He had already decided, half would go to his mom for bills, and the other half would be saved for Lily's medicine. By closing time, Mr. Graham made his rounds, inspecting each station. When he reached Ethan's, he gave a small, approving nod. "Not bad, Carter. You follow instructions well. That's good. Too many young people these days think rules don't matter." "Thank you, sir," Ethan said, trying not to smile too much. Inside, he felt a small swell of pride. When Ethan got home, Lily greeted him excitedly. "Did you see LeBron James?" "What about Anthony Davis?" she asked, bouncing on her heels. "No players today," Ethan said, ruffling her hair. "But just wait until game night." Later, after Lily went to bed, Ethan found his mom at the kitchen table. She was surrounded by a pile of bills, a calculator clicking in her hands. She looked up and smiled faintly. "So, how was your first day?" Ethan sat down and leaned back in his chair. "It was great. Mr. Graham said I did a good job. And Sophie showed me all these cool tips. I can even see part of the court from my station. It's better than I imagined." "That's wonderful, Ethan," his mom said. "I'm so proud of you." He felt a warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't just the job, or the chance to see his basketball heroes in person. It was the knowledge that he was helping. He was doing something that mattered, for Lily, for his mom, and maybe even for himself. As he got ready for bed, he looked at the uniform hanging neatly on the door. The moonlight caught the Lakers logo, making it glow. Ethan smiled to himself. This was just the beginning. Ethan woke up that morning with a strange mix of nerves and excitement. It was finally here, his first game night working at Crypto.com Arena. The Lakers were playing the Boston Celtics, and the whole city buzzed with anticipation. He knew this wasn't just any game. It was a showdown that could decide the team's playoff spot. The stakes felt as high for him as they did for the players. As he rode the bus downtown, Ethan imagined the electric atmosphere he was about to step into. He'd watched countless Lakers games on TV with his family, but now he'd be part of the action, even if only from behind the concession counter. The bus passed by giant billboards featuring Lakers stars, LeBron James and Anthony Davis towering over the streets of Los Angeles. Ethan's heart pounded. Today wasn't just about earning a paycheck, it was about being part of something bigger. Something he'd dreamed of for years. At the arena, Ethan clocked in early. As always, the main concourse was already bustling. Vendors were stocking trays of nachos, filling soda machines, and rolling carts loaded with merchandise to the stands. Sophie caught sight of him and waved him over. "Nervous?" she asked, handing him an apron. Her smile was reassuring. "A little," Ethan admitted, tying the strings around his waist. "But mostly excited." "That's the spirit," Sophie winked. "Just remember what I taught you. The first rush is always the hardest. But once you find your rhythm, you'll define. And don't let Graham get under your skin. He's all bark." Ethan nodded, grateful for her encouragement. He double-checked his station, ensuring everything was stocked and clean. Mr. Graham passed by, clipboard in hand, giving curt nods as he inspected each stand. When he reached Ethan, he paused. "Carter," Graham said, his tone sharp as usual. "What's the rule about celebrities?" Ethan straightened up. "No special treatment, sir. Everyone's just a customer." "Good. Keep it that way." Graham made a note on his clipboard and moved on, leaving Ethan to exhale the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The first wave of fans poured in about an hour before tip-off. Ethan's hands moved quickly, scooping ice, pouring drinks, and passing out pretzels and popcorn. The line grew steadily, but he kept up. even managing to flash a quick smile at a young boy who was wearing a jersey 2 sizes too big. The kid grinned back, clutching his soda like it was a trophy. Ethan's eyes wandered to the main floor whenever he had a spare second. The arena was filling up fast. Purple and gold jerseys were everywhere, blending into a sea of Lakers pride. The giant screen above the court displayed pregame highlights, and Ethan caught a glimpse of LeBron dunking in warm-ups. For a moment, he was just another fan, caught up in the thrill of it all. As the game began, the noise in the arena was deafening. Every three-pointer brought the crowd to their feet. Each fast break had them roaring. Ethan couldn't help but steal glances at the court. LeBron James moved like a force of nature, weaving through defenders, his every move calculated and precise. Anthony Davis dominated the paint, blocking shots and grabbing rebounds. It was the Lakers at their best, and Ethan felt lucky just to be in the building. Then came the third quarter. The Celtics had fought back from a deficit, and the game was tight. The crowd's energy had shifted, becoming more anxious, more intense. Ethan's line was shorter now as fans stayed glued to their seats. But his heart raced just as fast. He knew the final minutes would be a nail-biter. Suddenly, a timeout was called, and the big screen zoomed in on the Lakers bench. Ethan froze. The camera focused on LeBron, and Ethan's stomach dropped. Something was off. LeBron James's complexion looked pale under the bright lights, and his shoulders slumped slightly as he breathed heavily. Ethan recognized that look. It wasn't exhaustion from the game, it was something deeper. Something he had seen before in the hospital when visiting his mom. His eyes darted to the special drinks stored in the back fridge. These weren't just any drinks, they were kept separate, marked with distinctive caps and labels. They were for emergencies. Ethan had memorized the colors and what they meant, even though he wasn't supposed to handle them. His training with Sophie had been thorough, and he had studied the employee manual front to back. He knew what that particular blue bottle with the silver cap was for. But he hesitated. Mr. Graham's voice rang in his head. No special treatment. No exceptions. If he ran out there and handed that drink to LeBron, he'd be breaking the biggest rule. He'd lose his job. The knot in his chest tightened. Then he thought of Lily. He thought of how his mom always put others first. How she'd told him to do his best and be someone people could count on. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant taking a risk. He grabbed the blue drink, his hand trembling, and stepped away from the counter. The crowd seemed to blur around him as he moved. He passed the security checkpoint, his purple uniform granting him access where others would have been stopped. As he approached the Lakers bench, a guard blocked his path. "Kid, you can't be here," the guard said firmly. Ethan held up the drink, trying to explain. "It's for LeBron James. Something's wrong. He needs this." The guard frowned, clearly uncue. LeBron turned and caught sight of Ethan. Their eyes met briefly, and to Ethan's surprise, LeBron nodded. "Let him through." LeBron James. The guard stepped aside, and Ethan rushed forward, his heart pounding. He handed the bottle to LeBron, who took it with a grateful nod. The big screen above the court captured the moment, the crowd erupting in cheers. It looked like a heartwarming scene, a young worker helping their basketball hero. Ethan barely had time to process it. He turned to head back to his station. And there he was, Mr. Graham, arms crossed, face dark as a storm cloud. Ethan knew what was coming. The rest of the game passed in a blur. The Lakers won in the final seconds, the arena exploding in celebration. But for Ethan, it was bittersweet. As the final buzzer sounded, Graham told him to report to the office the next morning. Sophie gave him a sad smile, her eyes saying what she didn't need to: "I'm sorry." Ethan packed up his things in silence and headed home. On the bus ride back, the cheers from the game still echoed in his ears. But all he could think about was the meeting with Graham. He had done the right thing. He had helped someone in need. But at what cost? At home, Lily was waiting for him. She didn't need to ask, his face said it all. "You did the right thing," she whispered as she hugged him tightly. Ethan clung to those words as he lay in bed that night. He stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over again. Something big was coming. He could feel it. He just didn't know what. Ethan didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Graham's expression, the crossed arms, the look of quiet disappointment that spoke louder than any reprimand. And every time he thought of that look, he felt the same sting of regret. Not for what he had done. He still believed he had made the right choice, but for the reality of what was to come. By the time his alarm buzzed the next morning, Ethan was already dressed. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. His mom, who worked the night shift again, was still asleep. Lily's faint snores drifted from the room down the hall. Ethan didn't have the heart to wake either of them, even just to say goodbye. He grabbed his bag, slipped out the door, and began the walk to the bus stop. The ride to the arena felt different this time. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows over his lap. The usual excitement, the nervous buzz that came with starting something new, was gone. Instead, his stomach churned with uncertainty. He watched as the city passed by. Familiar streets and intersections he'd walked so many times before. But today they all seemed slightly off. Like the world had shifted somehow. And he wasn't quite sure where he fit anymore. The arena looked just as imposing as it had the day before, its massive steel and glass facade catching the sunlight. But Ethan felt none of the awe that had filled him when he first walked through those doors. Instead, he felt small, as if the weight of the building was pressing down on him. Inside, the usual buzz of activity was subdued. Most of the vendors were setting up for the day, their conversations hushed. Sophie was nowhere to be seen. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the hallways as he made his way to the office. Graham was waiting when Ethan arrived. He stood behind his desk, the same clipboard in hand, though he wasn't jotting anything down. His expression was unreadable, but his posture, straight-backed, arms crossed, made Ethan's heart sink. "Have a seat, Carter," Graham said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Ethan sat, gripping the edge of the chair. Graham didn't speak right away. He looked down at the clipboard, then out the window, as if he were carefully choosing his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured. "You're a good kid," he began, setting the clipboard on the desk. "You're polite, you follow directions, and you've got a strong work ethic. I see that. I've seen it from day one." Ethan's chest tightened. He knew there was a "but" coming. "But," Graham continued, "you broke the most important rule we have here. No special treatment, no exceptions." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "It's not just a guideline, Carter. It's a policy we enforce for a reason. Once we start making exceptions, the whole system falls apart. And as much as I admire your intentions, I can't ignore what happened." Ethan wanted to speak, to explain that he hadn't done it for personal gain, that he had acted on instinct because something had been wrong. But Graham raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not here to debate what you did. I'm here to talk about what happens next." Ethan swallowed hard. "I have to let you go," Graham said, his voice softening slightly. "It's not an easy decision, but it's the right one for this organization. I hope you understand." Ethan nodded slowly, though he didn't truly understand. "I want you to know," Graham added, "this doesn't mean you're not good at what you do. It doesn't mean you're a bad employee or that you made the wrong call as a person. But as your supervisor, I have to enforce the rules, even when it's difficult." Ethan forced himself to meet Graham's eyes. "Thank you for giving me the chance," he said quietly. Graham's expression softened, just a fraction. "Good luck, Carter. I have no doubt you'll land on your feet." As Ethan walked out of the office, the building felt even bigger, more intimidating. His footsteps seemed to echo louder than before, each step a reminder of what he had just lost. The bus ride home was long, the streets blurring into a haze. When he finally stepped off at his stop, he stood for a moment on the sidewalk, staring at the small apartment building ahead. He thought of Lily inside, probably working on her homework, and his mom still asleep after another grueling night shift. They were counting on him, and now he'd had to tell them he'd been let go. His shoulders slumped as he walked up the stairs. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel like the same Ethan Carter who had proudly put on that uniform just a day ago. He felt small, defeated, and lost. The apartment door creaked as he opened it. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, and Lily's voice carried from the kitchen. "Ethan, you're home early." He froze in the doorway. She sounded so happy, so carefree. His mom appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Ethan, how was?" Her smile faltered as she took in his expression. "What happened?" Ethan set his bag down by the door, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know how to start. He didn't know how to tell them that the job they had all counted on, the job that was supposed to help them get ahead, was gone. Ethan? Lily's voice was softer now. Worried. He took a deep breath. I got fired. The words hung heavy in the air. His mom stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. Why? I broke a rule, Ethan admitted. LeBron James wasn't looking good. I thought, he stopped, his voice catching. I thought it was the right thing to do. I gave him a special drink. I wasn't supposed to. And Mr. Graham, he shook his head, unable to finish. His mom's face softened. She pulled him into a hug, her arms strong and steady. Oh, Ethan, she murmured, you have such a good heart. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy. But I'm proud of you. Don't ever forget that. Lily hugged him from the other side. Me too, she said. You're my hero. For a moment, Ethan let himself lean into their warmth, into their support. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew he wasn't facing it alone. Ethan had expected the morning after his firing to be quiet. He assumed the world would move on without giving him a second thought. But when he woke up, the first thing he noticed was the sound of his phone buzzing constantly. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, squinting at the screen. There were dozens of notifications, texts, missed calls, social media alerts. His heart sank. He tapped on one of the messages. It was from Sophie. Ethan, you need to check online. You're everywhere. Puzzled, he opened a browser, and there it was. Clips of the game. Specifically the moment he had handed the special drink to LeBron James, were plastered all over the internet. Fans had captured the scene from multiple angles. A close-up shot of Ethan offering the drink. A wide shot of LeBron James recovering and nodding in gratitude. The crowd cheering. The captions varied. Some called it the most wholesome moment of the game. Others proclaimed Ethan a hero, someone who stepped up when no one else noticed something was wrong. A hashtag had started. #Justice for Ethan. As he scrolled through the comments, Ethan's chest tightened. Most of them were positive. People praised him for caring more about the players' health than the rules. Some questioned the arena's policy, calling his firing unjust. Others shared their own stories, times when they had done the right thing, only to face consequences. Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. But there were also voices of dissent. A handful of commenters criticized him, arguing that he should have followed the rules no matter what. A few even suggested he had done it for attention, a claim that stung deeply. Ethan stared at the screen, feeling a wave of frustration. This wasn't what he wanted. He hadn't acted to gain fame or sympathy. He had acted because, in that moment, it felt like the only thing he could do. But now, his life was on display for everyone to judge. Lily walked into the room, still rubbing her eyes. Ethan, why is your phone so loud? Nothing, he said quickly, locking the screen and shoving the phone under his pillow. Just people talking about last night. Talking about you? Lily tilted her head. What did you do? He sighed. It's complicated. Some people think what I did was right. Others think it was wrong. She sat down next to him. What do you think? I think I did the right thing, Ethan said firmly. But I don't know if it matters anymore. It matters to me, Lily said. Her simple, unwavering confidence made him smile. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Ethan tried to ignore his phone, but the notifications kept coming. By noon, local news outlets had picked up the story. Clips of him and LeBron aired alongside headlines like, "Teen worker fired for helping LeBron James," and "Good Samaritan or rule breaker." Reporters camped outside the arena, hoping for a comment from the Lakers or from Ethan himself. That evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his mom and Lily, the television was tuned to a sports channel. A panel of analysts debated the incident. "Look, I get that rules are rules," one commentator said, "but this kid clearly had good intentions. He saw something was wrong, and he acted. Shouldn't that count for something? But the arena's policy exists for a reason." Another analyst countered, "If everyone starts making exceptions, it creates chaos. Maybe the punishment was harsh, but the rules were clear." Ethan turned off the TV. He couldn't bear to watch anymore. His mom reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "Ethan, we're proud of you. That's what matters. Let people talk. At the end of the day, you did what you felt was right. And that's something no one can take away from you." He nodded, though he still felt the weight of the scrutiny. Later that night, as he lay in bed, He picked up his phone again. There was one new message that caught his eye. Sent from an unknown number. The text was short, just one line. You did the right thing. Stay strong. This isn't over. Ethan stared at it, his heart racing. The sender's identity was a mystery. But the message felt genuine. Someone out there understood. Someone knew the truth. And even though the road ahead was uncertain, Ethan felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Ethan stood in front of his bedroom mirror the next morning, adjusting the same dress shirt he'd worn to his sister's school recital a year ago. He smoothed out the collar, fidgeted with the buttons. This was different. This was something big. He wasn't sure exactly what yet, but he could feel it. A kind of restless energy thrumming under his skin. It had started with the call from the Lakers' HR department. The woman on the line had been polite, direct. They wanted to talk to him. In person. Ethan had stumbled over his words, asking why, what they wanted, but the woman hadn't offered much detail. Just come down to the facility. She'd said, tomorrow morning, bring your ID. And so, here he was, nervous, hopeful, and more than a little confused. Ethan, honey, are you ready? His mom's voice came from the kitchen. He took a deep breath and stepped out. She stood by the table, her work clothes freshly ironed but her face still showing signs of fatigue. Even so, she smiled at him the way she always did, with a kind of quiet, steady confidence. Lily sat at the table, eating cereal and scrolling through her tablet. I'm good, Ethan said, ready as I'll ever be. Mrs. Carter grabbed her purse. I'm going with you. Mom, you don't have to. She held up a hand, cutting him off. Yes, I do. If someone's calling you in, I want to know what's going on. Besides, it'll be nice to spend the morning together. I'll take a personal day. I already called the hospital. Ethan wanted to protest, but the look in her eyes told him not to bother. The bus ride to the Lakers facility was quiet. Ethan kept glancing at his mom, who sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She'd always been his rock, the person who held everything together. And now, even though he wasn't sure what awaited them at the other end of this ride, he felt a little steadier knowing she'd be there. When they arrived, the building loomed larger than Ethan remembered. The sun glinted off the glass windows, and the giant Lakers logo above the entrance seemed to watch over everyone who walked through the doors. A security guard at the front desk checked their IDs and made a call. Carter party is here, he said into his radio, then gestured for them to follow him. The halls were sleek and modern, lined with framed photos of Lakers greats, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Kobe Bryant. Ethan felt a strange mix of awe and nervousness. He couldn't believe he was walking through the same halls as so many legends. They were shown to a conference room with glass walls. The room was simple but professional, a long table, a few chairs, a monitor on the far wall. A woman in a sharp blazer and heels walked in, followed by a man in a suit. They introduced themselves as Ms. Taylor and Mr. Lawson. Thank you for coming, Mr. Lawson said, extending a hand to Ethan. Then to Mrs. Carter, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Ethan swallowed hard. Sure, can I ask why I'm here? Ms. Taylor smiled, though her expression remained serious. We'll get to that. First, we need you both to sign these. She set a stack of papers on the table. Mrs. Carter frowned. What are these for? Non-disclosure agreements, Ms. Taylor said. What we're about to discuss involves sensitive information. These documents ensure that nothing shared in this room leaves this room. Mrs. Carter took the documents, her brows furrowing as she read through them. Ethan is a minor. I'll need to review these thoroughly before signing. Of course, Ms. Taylor said, folding her hand table. The room fell silent for a few minutes as Mrs. Carter carefully read each page. Ethan sat quietly, his pulse quickening. It wasn't just about the incident at the concession stand. This felt bigger. When his mom finally set the papers down, she nodded. All right, we'll sign. They both scribbled their names. And Ms. Taylor, she said, now we can begin. Ethan slightly, his palms damp. So, what is this about? Mr. Lawson glanced at Ms. Taylor, then back at Ethan. It's about what happened during that timeout. Ethan's stomach dropped. Mr. Lawson continued. First, I want to make it clear that your quick thinking didn't go unnoticed. You saw something was wrong with LeBron, and you acted. That's commendable. Ethan shifted in his seat. I thought he needed help. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. You didn't, Ms. Taylor assured him. In fact, what you did may have prevented a more serious situation. What we need to understand is how you knew. How I knew? Ethan repeated, confused. Ms. Taylor nodded. LeBron James's condition isn't public knowledge. Very few people are aware of it. But you seemed to recognize the symptoms almost immediately. We want to know what you saw. What made you take action? And, more importantly, how you knew which drink to grab. Ethan hesitated, glancing at his mom. She gave him a small nod. He turned back to Ms. Taylor. I've seen my mom work in the hospital before. I've seen what it looks like when someone's blood sugar drops. LeBron James looked pale, shaky, like he couldn't focus. And I remembered those drinks in the back fridge. I wasn't supposed to handle them. But I read the labels during training. I knew the blue one with the silver cap was for that kind of situation. Ms. Taylor and Mr. Lawson exchanged a glance. That's impressive, Mr. Lawson said. Most employees don't pay that much attention to the labels. And even fewer would have noticed those symptoms in the first place. Ethan shrugged. I thought he needed it. And you were right, Ms. Taylor said. She leaned forward, her tone more serious now. But what you didn't know is that what you saw in LeBron is part of a larger issue. It's not just him. Other players across the league have experienced similar symptoms. The problem isn't widespread yet. But it's becoming more common. And that's why we brought you here. Ethan frowned. I don't understand. We're investigating what's causing these episodes. Mr. Lawson explained. And we need people who can recognize the signs. People like you. Ethan blinked. You mean you want my help? Ms. Taylor nodded. We're offering you an internship. You'll work with our medical team, learn from our staff, and help us develop new protocols for identifying these issues early. It's a serious commitment, but it's also an opportunity to make a difference, not just for LeBron James, but for every player in the league. Ethan stared at them, stunned. He glanced at his mom, who smiled encouragingly. Think about it, Mr. Lawson said. Talk it over with your mom. We'll give you a few days to decide. As they left the facility, Ethan's mind was spinning. This wasn't what he had expected. But as he walked beside his mom, her hand on his shoulder, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger than he ever imagined. Ethan sat at the kitchen table that evening, staring at the offer letter. The words were printed clearly, yet they seemed to swim before his eyes. His mom sat across from him, Lily next to her with a book in her lap. The three of them hadn't spoken much since they got home. The air was heavy, but not tense, just full of unspoken thoughts, unasked questions. So, Mrs. Carter finally broke the silence. What do you think? Ethan hesitated, his fingers brushing the edges of the paper. It's a lot. Working with the Lakers medical team? That's huge. But what if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough? His mom gave him that look she always did, the one that was equal parts encouraging and firm. Ethan, you've already proven you're capable. You recognized something no one else did. That's not luck, that's instinct. And instincts can be trained. Lily glanced up from her book, her wide eyes full of curiosity. Does this mean you'll be like a doctor for basketball players? Not quite, Ethan said, managing a small smile. It's more like I'd be helping the team's doctors, learning how to spot problems early, how to take care of the players if something happens during games. Lily nodded sagely. So, basically, you're their superhero sidekick. Mrs. Carter laughed softly, and Ethan felt some of the weight on his chest lift. Something like that, he said. You don't have to decide tonight, his mom said. Take some time to think it over. But as Ethan lay in bed later, staring at the faint glow of his phone on the nightstand, he realized he already knew what he wanted. The fear was still there, fear of failing, of stepping into a world far bigger than anything he'd imagined. But there was also excitement, a spark of something new and promising. The next morning, Ethan called Mr. Lawson and accepted the offer. The phone call was brief, professional, but when it ended, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. He'd taken the first step into uncharted territory, and there was no turning back now. The first week of his internship was overwhelming in the best way possible. Ethan spent his afternoons at the Lakers facility, shadowing Dr. Bennett and her team. The days were long, but he didn't mind. He was learning more than he had ever imagined about nutrition, player health management, and the intricacies of sports medicine. Dr. Bennett, a tall, No-nonsense woman with a sharp eye and a quick wit. Quickly became both mentor and drill sergeant. She didn't sugarcoat things. "You've got good instincts," she told Ethan during his first session. "But instincts can only take you so far. You need knowledge to back them up. You need discipline." Ethan nodded, eager to soak up everything she said. He stayed late, studying the materials she gave him, memorizing the signs of dehydration, low blood sugar, and muscle fatigue. He practiced preparing the electrolyte drinks, learning the exact ratios of powders and liquids. He asked questions, hundreds of them, and even when Dr. Bennett rolled her eyes, he could tell she appreciated his curiosity. But not everyone was welcoming. Some of the other staff members whispered as he passed by. He caught snippets of their conversations. "That's the kid who got fired. Guess breaking the rules pays off after all. Must be nice to fail upward." Ethan tried not to let it get to him. Sophie had warned him it might happen. "People love to talk," she'd said, "but the best way to shut them up is to prove them wrong." And so he worked harder. He volunteered for every task, stayed late to study game footage, and listened carefully to Dr. Bennett's feedback. Little by little, he earned her trust. It wasn't until his first game on the bench that Ethan fully understood what he'd signed up for. The arena was packed. Thousands of fans filled the stands, their cheers and chants reverberating through the building. Ethan sat near Dr. Bennett, just a few feet away from the players. It was a perspective he'd never imagined having, so close he could hear the squeak of sneakers on the court, the smack of the ball on the hardwood. But he wasn't there to watch the game. His job was to watch the players. Every time LeBron James made a quick cut or Davis went up for a rebound, Ethan paid attention. He looked for the small details, how they landed, how they moved, how they held themselves between plays. Dr. Bennett had drilled it into him. "You're not a fan. You're a professional. See what others miss." At halftime, the medical team reviewed the data from the first 2 quarters. No red flags yet. Ethan felt a mix of relief and anxiety. So far, everything was fine. But what if something happened? What if he missed a sign? The third quarter began, and the game grew more intense. The Lakers had a slim lead, but the Celtics were closing in. The pace quickened, the players pushing themselves harder. Ethan's eyes stayed glued to the court. And then he saw it. Anthony Davis landed awkwardly after a contested rebound. It was subtle, just a small wince, a slight shift in how he planted his foot. But then it happened again on the next possession. And again, Davis started favoring one side, touching his ribcage every so often. Ethan glanced at Dr. Bennett, but she was focused on the data in front of her. The other trainers were busy with their own tasks. No one else seemed to notice. His heart raced. Should he say something? What if he was wrong? What if he was seeing something that wasn't there? But then he remembered what Dr. Bennett had said. See what others miss. "Dr. Bennett," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling underneath. "I think Davis is favoring his left side. He's touching his ribs after each jump. His breathing patterns changed, too." Dr. Bennett looked up sharply. Following Ethan's gaze, she watched Davis for a moment, then nodded. "Good catch. Let's get him checked out." The medical team moved quickly, calling Davis over during a timeout. It turned out Ethan was right. Davis had strained an oblique muscle, and catching it early prevented a more serious injury. Dr. Bennett gave him a brief nod. "Well done, Carter. You just saved us a bigger headache later." Ethan felt a swell of pride, but he didn't let it go to his head. There was still more to learn, more to prove. As the final buzzer sounded and the Lakers claimed a narrow victory, Ethan knew he had taken another step forward. This wasn't just about helping players. It wasn't just about the Lakers or the NBA. It was about becoming the kind of person who didn't wait for others to act, who saw what needed to be done and did it. And that, he realized, was exactly where he wanted to be. The days following the Lakers' narrow victory passed quickly, filled with meetings, training sessions, and more time on the court sidelines. Ethan was finding his rhythm, a delicate balance between absorbing new information and applying what he'd learned. Dr. Bennett had even started to loosen up around him, offering the occasional sarcastic comment that Ethan took as a sign of acceptance. But beneath the surface of routine, something else was brewing. Ethan began to notice whispers in the medical office, quick conversations that stopped when he walked into the room, staff members hunched over laptops, their expressions tight. Dr. Bennett seemed more focused than usual. her mouth drawn in a firm line. At first, Ethan tried not to think much of it. Maybe it was just the usual stress of working with professional athletes, he told himself. But the whispers didn't stop. And then, during a post-practice meeting, Dr. Bennett dropped a line that changed everything. "The numbers are increasing," she said, scrolling through a spreadsheet on the big monitor. "Which players?" one of the other trainers asked. "Not just ours," she replied, her tone clipped. "It's happening league-wide." Ethan sat up straighter. "What's happening league-wide?" he blurted before he could stop himself. The room went silent. Dr. Bennett turned to him. And for a moment, he thought she might snap at him for interrupting. Instead, she let out a small sigh. "You're already part of this, Carter. You might as well know." She tapped the monitor, highlighting a column of data. "Since the start of the season, we've seen a spike in players experiencing sudden blood sugar drops during games. It's not just a few isolated incidents. We've got data from multiple teams, multiple cities, and the patterns are eerily similar." Ethan frowned. "Why is it happening?" "That's the question we're trying to answer," Dr. Bennett said. "The league approved a new line of energy supplements last year, powders, bars, drinks. They're meant to help with endurance and recovery. But something's not adding up. Some players are fine, but others," she shook her head, "others are showing symptoms no one predicted. And it's not consistent. We don't know why certain players are affected and others aren't." Ethan's mind raced. He thought back to that night at the concession stand, to LeBron James's pale face and unsteady breathing, to the quick decision he'd made to grab that blue drink with the silver cap. At the time, it had felt like instinct. But now he wondered if he'd stumbled onto a bigger problem without even realizing it. "Why not just stop using the supplements?" he asked. "Not that simple," one of the trainers replied. "These products are backed by some powerful companies. Contracts, sponsorships, endorsements. It's a tangled web. And pulling them suddenly could cause chaos." Dr. Bennett crossed her arms. "We're not here to make policy decisions. Our job is to identify the patterns, treat the symptoms, and provide recommendations. But yes, Carter, you're right. This goes deeper than just our team. That's why we've been keeping it quiet." Ethan swallowed hard. He felt the weight of what they were telling him, the sheer scope of the issue. He'd thought he was just a kid learning the ropes, trying to help out when he could. But now he realized he was in the middle of something much bigger, something that could affect the entire league. That night, Ethan couldn't shake the conversation. He sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. He searched for news articles, press releases, anything that might shed light on the supplements Dr. Bennett had mentioned. But there was nothing. The energy products were still being touted as revolutionary, the next step in athlete recovery. No one was talking about adverse effects. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was Sophie. "How's the new gig treating you?" Ethan hesitated before typing back. "Good, I think, but something weird is going on." A few moments passed. Then her reply came in. "Weird how? Can't really talk about it. But it's big." Sophie didn't press further, though she did send one last message. "If anyone can handle big, it's you. Hang in there." Ethan put the phone down and leaned back in his chair. His thoughts kept circling back to what Dr. Bennett had said. League-wide patterns, something no one else was talking about. He thought about LeBron James, about the trust the superstar had shown in him that night. And then he thought about Lily, how she looked up to him, how she always believed he could do something important. For the first time, he felt the weight of responsibility. He wasn't just learning anymore. He was part of the solution. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. He continued his internship under Dr. Bennett's watchful eye, growing more comfortable with the demands of the job. Each day was packed with data analysis, hands-on training, and game day observations. He became more attuned to the subtle signs of physical stress in the players, often spotting patterns before others did. But as his skills improved, so did the tension around him. The whispers he'd first noticed hadn't stopped. In fact, they'd become louder, though no one spoke openly. Meetings were scheduled suddenly and canceled without warning. Some staff members began acting more guarded, carefully choosing their words when Ethan was nearby. The turning point came one evening after practice. Ethan was in the medical office, reviewing footage from the day's drills. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the computer and the occasional creak of someone walking down the hall. He heard a faint knock at the door. "Come in," he called without looking up. The door opened, and he expected to see Dr. Bennett or one of the trainers. Instead, a man in a suit stepped inside. Ethan had never seen him before. He wasn't part of the usual medical team, and he certainly wasn't a player. "Ethan Carter?" the man asked. His voice was calm, but there was something steely underneath. Ethan straightened in his chair. "Yes?" The man closed the door behind him and took a step closer. "I'm with a consulting group that works with the league. I understand you've been involved in some recent data collection." "Sure," Ethan replied, cautious. "What's this about?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say we're keeping an eye on things. These supplements," he paused, glancing at the computer screen. "We've heard there's been some concern among the staff." Ethan's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure where this was going, but the man's tone made his skin prickle. "What we'd like," the man continued, "is for everyone involved to stay focused on their jobs. There's no need to raise alarms or draw attention to something that may very well be a non-issue. Do you understand?" Ethan leaned back, narrowing his eyes. "I don't think I do." The man's smile faltered. "It's simple. You're here to learn, to help, not to stir the pot. Just keep your head down and do the work, and everything will be fine." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. What if it's not fine? What if there really is something wrong? The man's expression hardened. "Then that's not for you to decide." He adjusted his tie, his voice growing colder. "You're just an intern, Mr. Carter. My advice is to remember that." Without another word, the man turned and left, leaving Ethan sitting there, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. For a long moment, he didn't move. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself had changed. When Ethan finally made it home that night, his mom was sitting at the kitchen table, reading through a stack of bills. She looked up as he walked in, her face lighting up briefly before she caught his troubled expression. "Everything okay, Ethan?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, too quickly. "Just tired." She didn't press him, but her brow furrowed slightly. "If something's bothering you, you know you can talk to me." Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. The man's words echoed in his mind long after he'd gone to bed. "Keep your head down. Don't stir the pot." For the first time since starting the internship, Ethan felt genuinely uneasy. The next morning, he decided to confront Dr. Bennett. She was in her office early, going over the latest reports. When Ethan walked in, she glanced up, her sharp eyes immediately noticing the tension in his shoulders. "What's on your mind, Carter?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "Someone came to see me yesterday," Ethan said. "He said he was with a consulting group working with the league. Told me not to cause trouble." Dr. Bennett's jaw tightened, but she didn't look surprised. "What did he say, exactly?" "He told me to keep my head down, not to raise alarms, and that it wasn't my place to decide if something's wrong." Ethan's voice grew firmer. "What's going on, Dr. Bennett? Why would someone tell me that?" For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze steady. Then she leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. "There are people, powerful people, who don't want this issue to come to light. The league's partnerships, sponsorships, their entire image is tied up in these products. Admitting there's a problem would mean millions of dollars lost. Lawsuits, reputations destroyed." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "So they're trying to cover it up." Dr. Bennett nodded slightly. "Some would rather sweep it under the rug than deal with the fallout. And they're counting on people like you to stay quiet." Ethan clenched his fists. "What about the players? Their health? That should come first." "That's why we're here," Dr. Bennett said, her voice calm but firm. "That's why we're gathering data. Building a case. If we can present undeniable evidence, then they won't have a choice. But until then, we have to be careful." Ethan sat back, his mind racing. He thought of LeBron, of Davis, of all the players who trusted the system to keep them safe. And he thought about Lily. How she believed in him. How she saw him as someone who could make a difference. "I won't stay quiet," he said finally. Dr. Bennett raised an eyebrow. "You'll do what's right, Carter, but you'll do it smart. Understand?" Ethan nodded. He didn't have all the answers yet. But one thing was clear. He wasn't just an intern anymore. He was part of something bigger. And he wasn't going to back down. Ethan felt a shift in the air as soon as he arrived at the arena. The building was still humming with the usual pre-game energy, vendors shouting, fans streaming through the doors. The steady rhythm of pop music blasting from the speakers, but something about tonight felt heavier. More intense. The Lakers were set to face one of their toughest rivals. And the stakes were high. A win would solidify their playoff standing, while a loss would throw them into uncertainty. Ethan walked through the main concourse, past walls lined with larger-than-life banners of Lakers legends, and tried to calm the nerves churning in his stomach. Dr. Bennett greeted him in the medical office, already reviewing a stack of data from the last practice. She looked up briefly as Ethan entered. "Carter," she said, motioning for him to come closer. "How are you feeling about tonight?" "Good," Ethan replied automatically, though his voice carried a slight edge of uncertainty. Dr. Bennett caught it immediately. "Nervous?" "Maybe a little," he admitted. "It's my first big game since starting the internship. I just don't want to miss anything important." Her sharp gaze softened slightly. "You've got good instincts. Trust them. And if you see something, speak up. We'd rather check on a player unnecessarily than miss a potential issue." Ethan nodded, her words steadying him. He grabbed a clipboard and began reviewing the baseline data on the players, familiarizing himself with their normal levels so he'd recognize any deviations during the game. By the time the first quarter started, the arena was electric. Fans roared as the players took the court, the energy bouncing off the walls and making the floor tremble. Ethan watched from his spot near the Lakers bench, clipboard in hand, his eyes darting between the players and the data on his sheet. LeBron looked strong, focused, determined, every movement precise. Anthony Davis was equally dominant, controlling the paint with ease. For the first quarter and much of the second, everything seemed to be running smoothly. Then, just before halftime, Ethan noticed something. It wasn't with LeBron James this time, or even Davis. Instead, it was one of the team's younger guards, a fast, scrappy player known for his hustle. Ethan saw him wince after a hard drive to the basket. At first, he thought it might just be fatigue. But then it happened again on the next play. And again, the guard started favoring his left leg, his movements slightly stiffer than usual. Ethan frowned, glancing down at the clipboard. The data didn't show any red flags yet, but something about the player's body language set off alarm bells in Ethan's head. "Dr. Bennett," he said, keeping his voice low, "I think there's something going on with number 11. He's moving differently, favoring his left side. I think he might have tweaked something." Dr. Bennett looked up sharply. She followed Ethan's gaze, watching the player closely for a few moments. "Good catch," she said finally. She turned to one of the trainers and relayed the observation. During the next timeout, the medical staff pulled the guard aside, checked him out, and confirmed that he'd strained a muscle in his left calf. It wasn't serious, but catching it early prevented the injury from worsening. When Dr. Bennett returned to her seat, she gave Ethan a small nod. "You were right. Well done." Ethan felt a surge of pride. He hadn't just been lucky, he'd seen something others missed, acted on it, and helped protect a player. As the game entered the final quarter, the tension on the court, and on the bench, reached a fever pitch. The Lakers held a slim lead, but their opponents were relentless, clawing their way back with every possession. Ethan found himself more alert than ever, scanning the players for any sign of trouble. And then it happened. LeBron James, who had been playing nearly the entire game without a break, started showing subtle signs of fatigue. It was nothing obvious at first, just a slight hesitation on his cuts. A split second longer to recover after a dunk. But then Ethan caught it. The same pale look he'd noticed weeks ago. The same uneven breathing. His heart raced. He glanced at Dr. Bennett, who was busy reviewing stats on her tablet. The other trainers were focused on Davis, who was gearing up for the next defensive play. No one else seemed to see it. Ethan's hand tightened around his clipboard. Should he say something? What if he was wrong? But then he remembered Dr. Bennett's words. Trust your instincts. Code blue, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. Dr. Bennett looked up immediately. What did you see? LeBron's showing the same signs as before, Ethan said. He's pale. His breathing's off. I think his blood sugar might be dropping again. Dr. Bennett didn't hesitate. She signaled to the trainers. And within seconds, the medical team was at LeBron James's side. They handed him the familiar blue drink with the silver cap. And within moments, his color improved. LeBron nodded at Ethan, a look of quiet gratitude in his eyes before he turned his focus back to the game. The Lakers pulled off a hard-fought win, the crowd erupting into cheers as the final buzzer sounded. But Ethan barely noticed. As the players celebrated, he sat back in his chair, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body. Dr. Bennett patted his shoulder. "You did good, Carter. That was a critical catch." Ethan managed a small smile. "Thanks, I just didn't want to miss anything." "And you didn't," she said firmly. "That's why you're here. Remember that." Ethan nodded. He felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a deeper sense of purpose. This wasn't just about watching a game or keeping stats. This was about helping people, real, tangible help that made a difference. As he packed up his things and headed home, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. He had passed his first real test, but he knew there would be more to come, and he was ready. The celebration after the game was short-lived. By the time Ethan returned home, his mind was already spinning with questions. Despite the satisfaction of catching the signs and preventing a serious issue on the court, he couldn't shake the feeling that these incidents were more than just isolated events. Over the next few days, Ethan spent every spare moment poring over the data he'd collected. Sitting at his small desk, laptop humming, he compared game footage with medical reports, cross-referencing symptoms, timelines, and player habits. He pulled up footage from not only the Lakers games but other teams' matchups, too. The more he watched, the more his suspicions grew. It wasn't just LeBron James. It wasn't just the young guard from the last game. There were subtle signs in other players. Small moments where their movements faltered or their expressions changed. The symptoms were often fleeting, a few seconds here, a slight stumble there, but they were unmistakable once Ethan knew what to look for. He created a spreadsheet, carefully logging each incident he could find, column after column filled with notes. Who it happened to, what quarter it occurred in, what the player's previous stats looked like. As the data piled up, a pattern began to emerge. And as it did, Ethan felt the gravity of what he was uncovering. At the next practice, Ethan brought his findings to Dr. Bennett. She was in her office, scanning over player reports on a large monitor when Ethan knocked lightly on the open door. "Carter," she said without looking away from the screen. "What's on your mind?" "I think I found something," he said, stepping inside. Dr. Bennett turned to him, one eyebrow raised. "What kind of something?" Ethan handed her his laptop. "I've been going through the footage and comparing it with the player data. Look here." He pointed to a series of entries on the screen. "These are all from the last few weeks. Different players, different teams, but the timing is consistent, usually late in the game. Sometimes after a hard drive or a fast break. The symptoms aren't always the same, but they follow a similar pattern: sudden fatigue, shaky movements, pale complexion, and most of them match up with players who've been using that new supplement." Dr. Bennett leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the data. For a long moment, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a low sigh. "I knew it wasn't just us," she muttered, almost to herself. Ethan blinked. "You knew?" "I suspected," Dr. Bennett admitted. She set the laptop down and leaned back in her chair. "I've seen hints of this in our own players. LeBron's issues weren't the first, and I doubt they'll be the last. But we haven't had enough hard evidence to back up the theory. That's why we've kept it quiet, until we know for sure. Making accusations could cause chaos." "Well, now we have data," Ethan said, his voice firm. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Dr. Bennett nodded slowly. "It's a start," she agreed, "but this is going to get messy. If we go public with this, it won't just be about player safety. It'll be about money, contracts, reputations. The companies behind these supplements won't take this lying down." Ethan's pulse quickened. "But it's the right thing to do, isn't it? If these supplements are causing harm, the players need to know. The league needs to know." Dr. Bennett regarded him for a moment, her sharp eyes searching his face. "You've got guts, Carter. I'll give you that." "It's not about guts," Ethan said quietly. "It's about doing what's right." Dr. Bennett smiled faintly. "That's why I brought you on board." "All right, let's present this to the higher-ups. But don't expect them to roll out the red carpet. If we're going to push this forward, we'll need more than just numbers. We'll need testimony, cooperation from the players themselves." Ethan nodded. He was ready. The next step was reaching out to the players who had experienced these symptoms. Dr. Bennett called a few of them into private meetings. sharing the data Ethan had collected and asking if they'd noticed anything unusual. Some were hesitant, reluctant to speak out. Others were more forthcoming. "Yeah, I've felt it," one player admitted. "I thought it was just me. Like I was having an off night. But now that you mention it, it's happened more than once." Dr. Bennett documented everything. With each conversation, the pattern became clearer, the evidence more compelling. But not everyone was supportive. One afternoon, as Ethan was reviewing data in the medical office, a senior staff member from the league's health department walked in. He was an older man with a stern expression, his suit impeccably tailored. He introduced himself as Mr. Crane. "Carter," he said, his tone clipped. "I understand you've been compiling some rather sensitive information." Ethan set down his clipboard. "Just trying to help the team." Mr. Crane's eyes narrowed. "You should be careful, young man. There are protocols for these things. Procedures. Going outside those channels can cause unnecessary confusion, even harm." Ethan met his gaze, not backing down, so can ignoring the problem. Mr. Crane's jaw tightened. "I'm simply saying, tread carefully, and remember your place." When Mr. Crane left, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't the first time he'd been warned, but it was the first time someone from the league itself had confronted him. The pressure was mounting. As the days wore on, the team continued to build their case. Dr. Bennett helped Ethan refine his data presentation, tightening the analysis and highlighting the most compelling points. They worked late into the evenings, often alone in the office, fueled by takeout and determination. "We're close," Dr. Bennett said one night as they reviewed their findings for the 100th time. "Once we have this finalized, we'll bring it to the league's executive committee. But be ready, Carter. This is just the beginning. If they accept the data, great. If they push back," she shook her head, "well, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it." Ethan nodded. He knew this was far from over. But for the first time, he felt like they had a real shot at making a difference. They weren't just reacting to problems anymore, they were working to prevent them. To change the system for the better. He glanced at his laptop. The rows of data glowing on the screen. Every entry, every note represented a player whose health could be protected. And that, he realized, was worth whatever came next. When the day came to present their findings, the tension was palpable. Dr. Bennett had coordinated a meeting with the league's executive committee, a collection of senior officials whose decisions shaped the entire NBA. The meeting room was nothing short of intimidating. A long, polished table, rows of chairs that seemed too large, and a wall lined with digital screens displaying everything from player stats to league financials. Ethan sat at one end of the table, laptop open, a thumb drive in his hand. Dr. Bennett was to his left, her calm demeanor a steadying presence. Across from them, the committee members watched silently, their expressions unreadable. Some were older, their faces lined with years of experience, while others were younger, sharp-eyed and quick to take notes. "Dr. Bennett," began one of the senior executives, a man with silver hair and a deep voice, "we understand you have something significant to share. But let me be clear up front. This committee values hard data and actionable recommendations. Speculation won't move the needle." Dr. Bennett nodded. "Understood. That's why we've spent weeks gathering this data, cross-referencing it with player medical histories and performance metrics. Carter," she gestured toward Ethan, "has been instrumental in identifying the patterns we'll discuss today." Ethan inhaled slowly and began. He plugged in the drive, and the room's largest screen lit up with his presentation. Row after row of data points appeared, game footage, medical reports, and charts highlighting the increase in late-game symptoms. His voice was steady as he walked through the trends, the frequency of incidents, the players affected, and the timelines that aligned almost perfectly with the introduction of the new supplements. As he clicked through slides, Ethan glanced at the faces around the table. Some leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as they studied the graphs. Others remained expressionless, arms crossed, not even glancing at the screen. The air was thick with unspoken opinions. When he finished, Dr. Bennett took over. She summarized the findings, emphasized the need for immediate action, and outlined a set of recommendations, halting the use of the implicated supplements, conducting further testing, and implementing stricter oversight of products used league-wide. For a moment, the room was silent. Then one of the younger executives leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "This is compelling data," he said, his tone measured. But it's incomplete. These patterns you've identified, they suggest a correlation, not causation. Have you tested the supplements directly? Do you have definitive proof that they're the source of these issues? Ethan's stomach sank. He had anticipated this question, but it didn't make it any easier to answer. We haven't conducted lab tests on the supplements themselves, Dr. Bennett admitted. Our findings are based on observational data and player reports. But the patterns are consistent, and the timing aligns exactly with the introduction of these products. Another committee member spoke up, her voice sharper. Consistent patterns are a start, but they're not enough. If we pull these supplements based on incomplete data, we'll face backlash from manufacturers, sponsors, and potentially the players themselves. Not to mention the financial implications. Ethan felt a flash of frustration. But if we don't act, players' health will continue to be at risk, he said, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. How many more incidents need to happen before we take this seriously? The room turned to him. He met their gazes, his heart pounding. I'm not a doctor, he continued. I'm just an intern, but I've spent weeks looking at this data, watching footage, talking to players. I've seen what's happening, and it's not normal. If we wait for perfect proof, we might be too late. Dr. Bennett placed a steadying hand on his arm, but she didn't interrupt. The committee members exchanged glances. Some nodded slightly, others frowned. The silver-haired executive who had opened the meeting spoke again. Carter, I appreciate your passion, he said. Require more than passion. We need hard evidence. If what you're suggesting is true, we'll need to verify it with independent studies, not just internal observations. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. But while you wait for those studies, players are getting hurt. Isn't that worth considering? A murmur spread through the room. Dr. Bennett finally stepped in, her voice calm but firm. What Carter is saying is that the cost of inaction could be greater than the cost of acting now. We understand the risks, but we also understand our responsibility to these players. You don't need to make a final decision today, but we urge you to start the process. The silver-haired executive nodded slowly. We'll take this under advisement. Thank you for your time. The meeting ended without a clear answer. As the committee members filed out, some stopped to shake hands. Others offered brief words of encouragement. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being polite rather than genuine. When the room was empty, Dr. Bennett turned to him. You did well, she said. They're not going to do anything, are they? Ethan asked quietly. It's a start, she replied. Big changes don't happen overnight. But you made them listen. That's more than most people can say. Ethan nodded, though it didn't feel like a victory. As they gathered their things and left the room, he couldn't help but wonder if the committee's reluctance would come at a cost, one he couldn't afford to ignore. The meeting had felt more like a stalemate than a victory. As Ethan left the conference room with Dr. Bennett, he couldn't shake the sense of futility. The committee's hesitation, their insistence on more data and further studies, it all seemed like a way to avoid taking immediate responsibility. Back at the training facility, Ethan went through the motions of his usual tasks. He double-checked player hydration levels, reviewed footage from the previous night's game, and updated medical logs. Dr. Bennett gave him space, sensing his frustration, but even though he kept busy, the nagging doubt lingered. In the days following the presentation, nothing seemed to change on the surface. Practices continued, games were played, and players followed their routines. Ethan kept his eyes open, watching for any signs of trouble. And yet, despite the committee's lack of immediate action, he began to notice small shifts. For one, the medical staff began quietly phasing out the supplements that had been flagged. It wasn't announced officially, there was no memo, no directive from the higher-ups, but the trainers simply stopped offering those particular products. When players asked, they were given alternatives. No one made a big deal out of it. But Ethan saw what was happening. The medical team was taking precautionary measures without waiting for permission from above. Dr. Bennett later confirmed it. We're not broadcasting it, she said when Ethan asked. But we're not ignoring the data either. Sometimes, change starts quietly. Ethan couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. It wasn't the bold, sweeping action he had envisioned. But it was something. The players were being protected, even if it was done behind the scenes. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. A few weeks later, Ethan found himself back on the bench for another home game. It was a close contest. the kind that kept fans on the edge of their seats. LeBron James was in top form, and the energy in the arena was electric. But Ethan wasn't focused on the score. As always, his attention was on the players, their movements, their body language, the subtle signs that might signal trouble. Midway through the second quarter, he noticed one of the younger players breathing a bit harder than usual. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight increase in his recovery time after a sprint. Ethan flagged it, quietly mentioned it to Dr. Bennett, and they monitored him through the rest of the half. By the end of the game, the player was fine, no incidents, no need for intervention. Good eye, Carter, Doc afterward. You spotted it before it became an issue. That had become Ethan's new normal. His job wasn't just reacting to emergencies, it was preventing them. He still remembered the adrenaline rush of that first time he'd stepped in to help LeBron James. The way his heart had pounded as he handed over the drink. But now, his work was quieter, more deliberate. He was learning to see the problems before they reached that critical point. Back at home, Ethan tried to explain this new perspective to his mom and Lily. They sat at the kitchen table one evening, eating spaghetti and sharing stories about their day. Lily was excited about a school project, her words tumbling out faster than she could keep up. Mrs. Carter smiled warmly, listening as she helped Lily twirl noodles onto her fork. When Lily finally paused for breath, Ethan spoke. You know, it's funny. I always thought this job would be about big, dramatic moments, saving the day in front of a packed arena. But it's not. It's about seeing things before they get bad. About paying attention to the little stuff. Mrs. Carter nodded. That's what your dad used to say about firefighting. The best firefighters, he said, are the ones who notice the risks before the fire even starts. The ones who keep things from getting out of control. Ethan smiled faintly, thinking about his dad. Yeah, I guess it's kind of like that. Lily frowned. But I liked the big moment. You know, when you helped LeBron, that was cool. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, it was. But sometimes the coolest thing you can do is keep it from getting to that point in the first place. As the season continued, Ethan's confidence grew. He still faced challenges, players who didn't want to admit they felt off, coaches who questioned the need for extra precautions, but he also earned trust. When he raised a concern, people listened. When he suggested a change, it was considered. Slowly, steadily, the culture began to shift. It wasn't just about reacting to problems anymore, it was about preventing them. And while the league's executives hadn't officially acknowledged Ethan's findings, he noticed that more teams were reviewing their supplement protocols. Word was spreading, quietly, behind the scenes. The data he and Dr. Bennett had compiled was making a difference. One night, after a particularly long day, Ethan sat alone in the medical office. The arena was quiet, the lights dim. He looked at the latest set of player reports on the screen. The rows of numbers and notes that had become so familiar. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of calm. Things weren't perfect. The league still hadn't made a public statement. The supplements hadn't been banned outright. But fewer players were getting sick. Fewer incidents were slipping through the cracks. Ethan knew there was still work to do. Still more progress to be made. But he also knew that sometimes change didn't happen all at once. Sometimes it came in small, quiet victories, and those victories, however modest, mattered. They were proof that he was on the right track, that his efforts were making a difference. And for now, that was enough. The weeks passed with a steady rhythm. Practices turned into games, games into victories, and victories into incremental improvements. Ethan had become an integral part of the medical staff, not just an eager intern anymore, but someone whose observations were trusted and whose voice carried weight. Dr. Bennett relied on him more often, giving him responsibilities she hadn't entrusted to interns in years. Still, Ethan knew the deeper issue, the unexplained patterns. The dangerous supplements remained unresolved. The players who had felt those sudden, unexplained drops in performance were still quietly monitored. But the league's leadership had yet to act decisively. Without a public acknowledgement of the problem, no official changes could be made. That all changed on an unremarkable Monday morning. Ethan had just arrived at the facility, his bag slung over his shoulder and a coffee in his hand. He was about to step into the training room when Dr. Bennett stopped him in the hallway. "Carter," she said, her voice sharper than usual. "We've got something. Come with me." Ethan followed her to her office. On her desk was a thick envelope, its edges slightly worn. She picked it up and handed it to him. "What's this?" Ethan asked, confused. "Read it." Inside was a letter from one of the league's senior medical consultants. It was addressed to the executive committee, and it referenced the data Ethan and Dr. Bennett had compiled. But what caught his eye was the handwritten note attached to the first page. "We can no longer ignore the pattern. Immediate action is required. This is from Dr. Avery." Dr. Bennett explained, "One of the most respected voices in sports medicine. She's reviewed our findings and confirmed what we've been saying all along." Ethan scanned the letter again, his heart racing. Dr. Avery's endorsement was huge. Her name carried serious weight, and her urging for immediate action meant the league's decision-makers couldn't just bury the data in bureaucratic limbo anymore. "What does this mean?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. "It means," Dr. Bennett said with a rare smile, "they're finally paying attention. The league's holding an emergency meeting tomorrow. I'll be presenting our data again. And this time, I think they'll listen." The next day was a whirlwind. Ethan wasn't in the meeting, he didn't need to be. Dr. Bennett had told him to focus on his normal duties while she handled the presentation. But he felt the tension as he worked alongside the players and trainers. His mind constantly drifting to that conference room and the decisions being made behind closed doors. When Dr. Bennett returned, she looked tired but victorious. "Well?" Ethan asked, unable to keep the anticipation out of his voice. "They're moving forward," she said simply. "The supplements are being pulled from circulation. The league is conducting a full investigation into the manufacturing process. And in the meantime, they've mandated stricter monitoring of player health." Ethan's shoulders sagged in relief. Finally, the data had spoken loudly enough. Finally, the league was taking action. And they know who provided most of the data. Dr. Bennett added, her tone a little lighter. "You're getting a lot of credit, Carter." "I don't need credit," Ethan said quickly. "I just wanted them to do something." Dr. Bennett chuckled. "Good, because there's still plenty of work to do. This is just the start." In the days that followed, Ethan noticed a subtle but undeniable shift. The players were more relaxed, knowing the questionable supplements were no longer in their lockers. The trainers worked more closely with the medical staff, and the atmosphere in the facility felt lighter. Ethan's role didn't change much. He still spent his days monitoring hydration, tracking recovery stats, and running through countless spreadsheets, but he knew he'd played a part in something larger than himself. And the best part was knowing that the players he watched and admired were safer now. That was all he had ever wanted. Still, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what would come next. The changes the league had implemented were promising, but the road ahead was still long. He thought of Lily at home, cheering for him every step of the way, and his mom's quiet encouragement every morning before he left for work. He thought of the risks he'd taken, the challenges he'd faced, and the persistence that had finally paid off. Ethan didn't know exactly where his path would lead, but as he sat in the locker room one quiet afternoon, listening to the faint echo of basketballs on the court, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt proud. Ethan had finally come into his own. The league's decision to pull the questionable supplements and implement stricter monitoring was a victory. But it also marked the beginning of a new phase in Ethan's journey. He no longer felt like an outsider in the arena's halls or a kid pretending to be part of something bigger than himself. He belonged here. Dr. Bennett's confidence in him grew stronger with each passing week. She entrusted him with tasks that went beyond simple monitoring, like reviewing injury prevention protocols and brainstorming ways to improve player recovery routines. Ethan found himself sitting in on strategy sessions with veteran trainers and even offering insights that were taken seriously. But the highlight of this new chapter came one afternoon when Dr. Bennett called him into her office. She leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze softened by a rare smile. "I've got an interesting opportunity for you," she began. Ethan shifted in his seat, unsure of what was coming. "What kind of opportunity?" "Next month, there's a sports medicine conference in Denver. Top trainers, team doctors, and specialists from all over the league will be there," she explained. "I'd like you to attend. Represent the Lakers, share what you've learned, what we've accomplished, and learn from the best while you're at it." Ethan's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm just an intern." "Not anymore," Dr. Bennett said. "You've proven you can handle more responsibility. This conference is the next step. I think you're ready." The thought of standing in front of seasoned professionals, talking about the patterns he'd noticed and the changes the league was making. Was daunting, but it was also exhilarating. Ethan nodded, a small smile spreading across his face. I'd be honored. In the days leading up to the conference, Ethan prepared relentlessly. He pored over his data, refining his presentation slides and practicing how to deliver his findings. Dr. Bennett helped him polish his points, offering advice on how to handle questions from skeptical attendees. You're going to face tough questions, she warned him. Not everyone will agree with our approach. Some will challenge you. Try to poke holes in your conclusions. That's part of the process. Ethan nodded. He'd come a long way since that first night on the job. But he knew there was still so much to learn. This was his chance to prove he could hold his own among the best. When the day of the conference arrived, Ethan felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. The auditorium was massive, filled with rows of chairs that gradually sloped upward toward the back. The audience was a sea of medical professionals, each with years of experience and a reputation for rigor. Ethan stood backstage, his slides ready, waiting for his turn to step up to the podium. He glanced at Dr. Bennett, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Then, the conference coordinator announced his name, and he walked out onto the stage. The lights were brighter than he'd expected. He took a deep breath, gripped the edges of the podium, and began. He started with the data, the patterns he had uncovered, the trends that pointed to something deeper. He spoke about the players' symptoms, how they had been dismissed at first as random occurrences, and how the data had revealed a consistent issue tied to specific products. He described the steps the Lakers had taken, the changes in protocol, and the early results of those changes. As he spoke, Ethan saw faces in the audience shift. Some remained skeptical, their expressions cool and analytical, but others nodded, leaning forward as they followed his points. When he finished, there was a brief silence. Then, applause, not thunderous, but steady and sincere. During the Q&A session, the tough questions came. Ethan fielded them as best he could, drawing on his preparation and the lessons Dr. Bennett had taught him. When he didn't know the answer, he admitted it and promised to follow up. By the end of the session, he felt drained but proud. He had stood his ground, presented his findings, and shared a story that needed to be told. Back in Los Angeles, Ethan's reputation continued to grow. The conference presentation had opened new doors. Other teams reached out, asking for his input on their protocols. Former skeptics began to reconsider the data, and more voices joined the call for increased transparency and player safety. Ethan never sought the spotlight, but he welcomed the chance to make a difference. He realized that his journey wasn't just about helping the Lakers. It was about shaping a culture of care across the league, ensuring that players were protected and valued not just as athletes but as people. One evening, after a long day of work, Ethan sat in his room with his laptop open. He scrolled through an email from a trainer at another team, thanking him for sharing his findings and asking for advice on implementing similar changes. Ethan smiled. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about knowing he was making an impact. He thought back to his first shift, to the nerves he'd felt walking into the arena, and to the moment he'd handed LeBron James that blue drink. That single decision, born of instinct and a desire to help, had set him on this path. And while the road had been anything but smooth, it had led him to a place where he could truly make a difference. Ethan closed the laptop and looked out his window. The city lights sparkled, a reminder of just how far he'd come. But he knew this was only the beginning. Ethan's world had changed in ways he never could have imagined. What started as a simple internship, just a chance to earn some money, to be part of something he loved, had turned into something so much greater. Through small acts of instinct and courage, he'd helped bring to light an issue that many had overlooked, and he'd played a role in changing the way the league cared for its players. But even with all the strides he had made, Ethan knew his journey was far from over. The problem wasn't entirely solved. The league still had more work to do, and new challenges would always emerge. Yet, for the first time, he felt truly prepared for whatever came next. One sunny afternoon, Ethan sat at home, watching his sister Lily try to spin a basketball on her finger. It wobbled and fell after a few seconds, clattering to the floor. Almost had it that time, Ethan said, grinning. Almost isn't enough, Lily replied, grinning back. She picked up the ball, determination in her eyes, and tried again. Ethan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He had learned a lot from this experience, about himself, about the importance of stepping up even when it's hard, and about what it really meant to make a difference. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, behind the scenes. Sometimes it was just paying attention and caring enough to act. He thought of Dr. Bennett's words, "It's not just about reacting. It's about seeing what others miss and stepping in before it's too late." Ethan realized that philosophy didn't just apply to sports medicine. It was a way to live. Months later, as the season wound down and the playoffs began, Ethan felt a sense of calm confidence. The league's new protocols were in place, and he knew the players were safer because of them. The supplements that had caused so much trouble were gone, and the data he'd helped compile had sparked a conversation about accountability and player health that couldn't be ignored. Ethan wasn't in the spotlight. He wasn't giving interviews or standing at center court. But he didn't need to be. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing the work, making a difference. And as he looked ahead, he felt nothing but hope. There were more challenges to face, more problems to solve, and more opportunities to help. He didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready for it.